Ready now. Dr. Howard Brady, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Leon. Is Pauline still here? Or?
No.
Sorry. Senator, guests, I want to talk about how the climate models have been run and they're on steroids, and the data shows that the climate models are on steroids. The theme tonight is data. My background is I was an Antarctic scientist with my master's PhD. In 2011, I was the first Australian ever to be given the Scientist of the Year award by an American, by Illinois University, and it was a great privilege. The award was for my contributions to tracing climate history in Antarctica over the last 15 million years. The IPC have left us in a maze, standing in a hall of mirrors. Now, I've written a book called Mirrors and Mazes, a guide through the climate debate. 1,600 have been bought in the last 6 weeks. People are gradually finding it on our website because it's meant to be just a simple explanation of the problems in the climate debate. The critical decision about climate science in the 20th century happened in June 1979. The American Academy of Science met and they tried to determine, looking at the climate computer models that had been made at that time, what is the sensitivity of the Earth to a doubling of CO2. They had a climate model from a Japanese physicist called Manabe, an American called Kurt Bryan. One was doing the land, one was doing the ocean. And they tried to calculate what would happen if CO2 doubled. They assumed a link between CO2 and temperature. Their calculation included a doubling of CO2, more water vapour in the atmosphere and what it did, cloud cover, and also if the world got warmer and there was less ice and snow, then the surface of the Earth was black body and absorbed heat. They came up with, Manabe said 2 degrees. James Hansen, who was working on Venus at the time, said 4. So they came up with 3. They said the sensitivity of doubling due to CO2 was 1, water vapour about 0.7, clouds 1.3. That gets you to 3 degrees. But the main point is that as soon as you use that index that a doubling causes 3 degrees, all the people playing with climate models from 1979 onwards had models running on steroids. As soon as you have that sort of sensitivity, a high sensitivity, not just to the CO2 but to water vapour and to clouds, you must get a number of things. What you're going to get is CO2 it will predict rising temperatures, accelerating temperatures, more water vapour at the tropics, more storms. It's all coming from this index. Now, one of the things they predicted, I'm just hurrying a little bit, was there's more water vapour around. And the main water vapour event they had was this tropical hotspot in the troposphere between 8 and 12 kilometres in the tropics. And this hotspot then distributed heat polewards, very critical in the climate models. The only trouble is, if you look at the balloon data, there is no hotspot. The one on the left, there is the theoretical hotspot predicted by the climate models. The one on the right, the balloon data. You can't do satellites because satellites can really only hover about 300 or 400 kilometres up, and they can't get into they're unstable, they can't circulate through the stratosphere. And with the water vapour, what comes out of that? You heard Hansen talking about it in his book. More water vapour, more rain, more storms, more violent severe weather. Every time there's a storm, Professor Steven in Australia will get up and say this is a sign of climate change, things are getting worse and worse and worse. Again, what does the data say? There's no increase in storm frequency nor storm severity in the last 100 years. If you don't believe me, here's the data. Here are American hurricanes since 1850. graphed against rising CO2. Now in Florida, the population in 1900 was 500,000, 1960, 5 million, today 24 million. So when there's a cyclone, there's a lot more damage. But that doesn't mean to say it's been caused by rising CO2 levels at all. There was no sensitivity to that. US tornadoes. Where is the sensitivity to CO2? None. The worst year, 1974. Australian cyclones, since 1969, may be going down a bit. Professor Farquhar at ANU won the Australian Scientist of the Year award in 2015, looking at water vapour and the use of plants by water vapour and how the CO2 exchanges with the plants. And he found with his data that wind velocities in Australia have been dropping for 30 years. So much for the climate models predicting the opposite. But the main one here, the Americans keep a wind index in the tropics. It's the highest wind every 6 hours in the tropics. They've been keeping it since 1970 in the northern tropics and the southern tropic, Cancer tropic. Look at it. Where is the correlation to CO2? If you live near one of those peaks, you could say, oh, look, storms have been getting worse, but you're really only saying they've been worse for the last 6 years. When you look at the data over a period, no correlation. And what about clouds? Well, they are the biggest problem in all the climate. Even the IPC recognises that clouds are the biggest problem in the climate models. But 50% of the models say clouds have a negative forcing, 50% positive. That's from the IPC technical report in 2007. And that report also says clouds are the largest source of uncertainty in climate science. So what value are these ruddy models? There's no hot spot. The clouds are a huge uncertainty. But then the big thing is, riding on the National Academy's prediction of 3 degrees rise for doubling CO2, they are predicting sea level will accelerate. Well, what does the data say? Sea level's been rising steadily as the world has warmed since the 1850s. The rate's been about 15 to 17 centimetres a century. You can see on the left, it's like a ramp. It's not a curved ramp that a skateboarder uses. There's no acceleration. The main data from tide gauges all over the world. The biggest database at Liverpool in England, the Permanent Service for Mean Sea Level. How's the IPC dealt with this? When the IPC met in 1995, 2001, all the experts said the tide gauge data shows no acceleration of sea level. When they met in 2007 and 2014, now there's 70 experts in the technical committee, huzzah! They found the holy grail, there's acceleration. The acceleration came from a satellite system that they started to put up around 1993. There was Topex Poseidon, Jason 1, Jason 2, now Jason 3's up there. Wow, now look at it. The satellite suddenly shows acceleration jumping to 32 centimetres 100 years. And the IPCC in 2007, they just ignored the tide gauge data. They jumped to the satellite data. That was in agreement with their models. But then, 2011, the US Army Corps of Engineers, you don't realise how big it is, their annual budget's $1.5 billion. One of their head scientists and a scientist from Florida said, hey, there's problems with this satellite. It's not accurate enough. There's altimetry problems. Its readings are twice the tide gauge data. And there's something seriously wrong with the satellite. And you might say, oh, these guys are biased, climate skeptics or something. Then Professor Fu and Dr. Haynes at Caltech, 2014, also described the fact that Topex Poseidon was okay, but then Jason 1, Jason 2 were really out. But this was the clincher. And you can see here you've got a graph showing the tide gauge line and then this what I call the jumping frog. Suddenly we've jumped to this acceleration. Well, in 2012, the NASA engineers at Pasadena, the Jet Propulsion Lab, said there's so many problems with this satellite, we want to get rid of it. We want to put up a new system called GRASP. We want to get rid of it because the errors are in this system and they corrupt climate data, such as the measurement of sea level height. So are we now going to use a satellite system that NASA itself says needs to be replaced? Now, despite this, the IPCC, not two Ps, and the Australian CSI are still adjusting the well-capped tide gauges to the satellite. So here we've got, for example, the tide gauges, the low straight line, the median IPC prediction that's used by most Australian states, and I've just thrown in, just for fun, that absolutely catastrophic Potsdam Institute of Climate Impacts, where there's 400 Germans fiddling away. They're all catastrophists run by Hans Joachim Schellenhuber, and they are predicting up to 2 metres sea level rise this century. Last year, NOAA released 200 tide gauges, most in the east and west coast of America, but some Atlantic islands and Pacific islands, still no acceleration of sea level. There's got some there, Honolulu, San Diego, the Battery at New York, Los Angeles. They're not steepening up like a curved ramp. So which are more likely to have an error or a fault? These tide gauges or a satellite system that NASA wants to get rid of? And finally, the crazy adjustment. The sea level engineers in Australia are so scared of the IPC, they're not looking at the data. Here is the Denison data. Basically, Fort Denison has never been over 9 centimetres a century in its history, and the US Army Corps of Engineers looked at the Fort Denison data and said, actually, the last 30 years it's been decelerating. That's why it's not Modra and Hess, but the Manly Hydraulic Lab, looking at the last 20 years, said the rate's only 4 centimetres a century. But what happens? No, these engineers advising councils on the south coast or at Eurobodalla, they say, no, we've got to adjust Fort Denison to the satellite. So you take Fort Denison from 8 centimetres a century max and put it up to 32. That is just absolutely absurd. It's a crazy adjustment. The US Army Corps of Engineers say that Fort Denison is decelerating. The CSIRO is deceiving the Australian public. They are still saying the sea level is going up in their report to the public at 30 centimetres a century. So in conclusion, in the farce of cascading predictions, the climate models are on steroids. Scientists working from this 3 degrees sensitivity are ignoring the data. The models are not predicting that storms are, the models are predicting storms getting worse, more water vapour, accelerate. They are all absolutely wrong. So the IPC and the CSIRO have left us all as in a maze. We are stranded as in a hall of mirrors. So if you want to read more, a simple explanation of the climate debate, I don't waste time arguing with people. I like to give the data. People can make up their own mind. The idea was that this book would be so short you could read it on a plane flight. It's 170 pages. You can buy it on the internet at www.mirrorsandmazes.com.au. So I didn't come here just to advertise the book, but we are in trouble. We've been deceived by climate models. We've been led by people looking at computer screens and climate models for the last 40 years. Those models aren't working and we've been deceived. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Howard. Okay.